and welcome back to Dukascopy TV. I'm Natalie MacDonald. Now, a slightly more sombre note today as we mark the 12-year anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks on the US. Ed Karr of ACA is in the studio now to discuss the ongoing impact of these events on Americans overseas. Ed, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me again, Natalie.
Now, in your view, how has 9/11 affected overseas Americans regarding the Patriot Act and also the US budget?
Well, it's a great question. As you mentioned, it's a real somber act. We're coming up on the 12th year anniversary date here. And for overseas Americans, the events of 9/11 have had a specific immediate effect as well for all of us living outside the United States. The Patriot Act and a lot of legislation came into force after the events that happened. The United States government came out very quickly and declared 9/11 an act of war. And so because of that, it wasn't just a terrorism incident, it became an act of war, and a lot of legislation came into effect, most notably the Patriot Act. What did the Patriot Act do? It dramatically expanded the powers of the United States government, both in surveillance, but also in the financial realm. And in the financial realm is really where we find the most impact on overseas Americans. They tried to really crack down on the financing of terrorism through banks and overseas financial institutions. But unfortunately, overseas Americans have really felt a lot of ramifications from this Patriot Act. We have found over the years the legislation has evolved more and more. We now have a wonderful add-on called FATCA, which is reporting on all of the overseas bank accounts of U.S. citizens back directly to the United States Internal Revenue Service. And so what is the net result? Bottom line, overseas Americans have found it much harder to actually open bank accounts, even simple savings accounts. If you live overseas and you have an overseas address, a lot of times you cannot open a bank account with a bank back in the United States because they'll look, and that's part of the Patriot Act for their anti-terrorism requirements. They cannot open the bank account for you. So as an overseas American, let's say you live in Geneva, you're over here in Switzerland, you've moved recently as an expatriate for a job, you want to just go down to a local bank and open a bank account, a lot of the banks will not open a bank account for you. And why is that? The cost of compliance for the bank becomes very high. Both with FATCA and the Patriot Act, they have to have a tremendous amount of reporting requirements that the United States government demands. And so a lot of these institutions have just made the decision, you know what, it's easier and it's more economic for us not to have any U.S. citizens or Americans whatsoever. So they just decide one moment to another, let's close down the whole division, let's close down the whole department. We don't want any U.S. citizens, even Americans that have had accounts with a lot of banks over many years, long-standing relationships. They can abruptly close them from one moment to another. And it has really made the life very difficult for a lot of overseas Americans. So that's been one of the direct effects of the 9/11 and Patriot Act.
How also has the political landscape changed since these events?
It's a good question. I mean, we've had a transition of power in the United States. So we've gone from a Republican administration, President George Bush, who was the direct president during 9/11, and we went through an election. We now have a Democratic administration with President Obama. So the political process in the United States still works. Now, a lot of people might not be too happy with the outcome or whatever, but the process still works. How has the process changed? Obviously, the United States has become much more focused on this war on terrorism, on trying to protect the country. We've had institutions like the Department of Homeland Security, which did not exist before, which are now massive government organizations. And we also have more presidential power. So a lot more power has actually been focused at the executive level than the congressional level. And the president can do a lot of different things. They can carry on things like rendition, like you have areas, Guantanamo, that has been an eyesore for all different sorts of administration that are out there. But the political process in the United States has managed to work very well, and that's what the United States is all about, you know, having a democratic, fairly elected, free election system. And I think, you know, regardless of which way the political winds blow, the United States will continue to function very normally. Obviously, the whole 9/11 has changed the country and it's changed the society. You know, I remember my parents that are older. The defining moment of their generation was when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and they could remember specifically everyone to the person, to the day. If you talk to anyone in their 70s, they probably know where they were and what they were doing when they got the news that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And the younger generation, anyone from maybe 20 to 40, 50 years old, they all remember to the day what happened during 9/11. Where were you? What was going on when those airplanes flew into the Twin Towers? So the political process obviously has evolved because of that. There's a lot more emphasis on keeping the country safe. There's a lot more emphasis on protecting the country from future terrorist acts, which fortunately there have not been any major acts like 9/11 since then. But the political landscape tends to evolve and change all the time, and I think it'll do perfectly well going forward.
I think that's not something that's just exclusive to US citizens. I remember even myself, I know exactly where I was at the precise moment when the news of the Twin Towers attacks was coming through, in the same way that I also know exactly where I was when the discussion of the London terror bombings was as well. Now, looking to move forward and also looking at this idea of protecting Americans living abroad, how do you judge projects such as the Smart Traveller Enrollment Programme?
Yeah, the Smart Traveller Enrollment Program, the STEP program, has been put forward by the U.S. Department of State, and it's a program that Americans can voluntarily go enter their contact details if they're traveling to overseas countries. And I think it's a great idea. It's a great initiative from the State Department. There has not been a tremendous amount of participation, and you have to think, why is that? Well, quite honestly, the world has changed and the world has evolved. We don't live in the same world that we lived in 30 or 40 years ago. So 30 or 40 years ago, when you were an American and you traveled overseas, it was pretty new, it was unique, it was a very, very different experience. Today, everyone has a smartphone. Everyone is connected into the internet. Borders in our world have almost ceased to exist. So people think, okay, I'm traveling from the United States to Switzerland or to France or to Italy. I don't need to register on a US State Department website. My friends are going to keep me updated with SMSs. I can update my own Facebook page as I go. I get emails instantaneously. I have social media. And if anything does happen, well, my friends and family are going to call me on my cell phone. And that certainly happens. So I think if people are traveling to a more exotic foreign country, maybe something in the Middle East that actually has some conflict, maybe something in Africa that has health concerns or issues, they might go out and enroll on the STEP program. But other than that, most of the Americans that I talk to, they do not. Especially Americans overseas, we're a little different because we're used to living overseas, we're used to traveling overseas, we travel all the time. So we don't really go out and inform the State Department or enroll in the STEP program every time we do travel, but I think it's an excellent initiative. More and more recently, a lot of Americans that I speak to have become much more wary about the US government. And this happens both on taxation and just on general information gathering. So we've had the revelations recently of Edward Snowden and how powerful the National Security Agency are, how much information they collect. And a lot of people get very, very nervous about providing information back to the government. This is one of the negative consequences of 9/11. Post 9/11, we really live in this culture of fear. People are afraid. They're not just afraid of the terrorists. That's one issue. They're also afraid of the protectors. They're afraid of the government. They're afraid of the Internal Revenue Service. I can't tell you how many Americans I know that live overseas that really they wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning worrying that they haven't filed an FBAR. They worry that if I'm going to put my information on the STEP program, maybe the US government is building this secret database and they track my movements wherever I want to go. And the nice thing, especially living in Switzerland, Switzerland really prides and has a lot of enforcement on data security and data integrity, and they protect people's right to privacy very, very much. So I think people really value the right to privacy in today's day and age, and they just don't know what the consequences are of giving all of their personal information out to any government. And so they try and protect it more and more.
And something which perhaps feeds into the same themes, but I do want to touch upon just for a moment. Why are we seeing this trend now with Americans renouncing their US citizenship?
Well, it's a good point, but honestly, let's keep it all in context. And you see some sensational headlines that come out. Renunciations are up dramatically. Okay, they are. 2010, 2011, 12, probably into 13, we've seen an accelerating trend of renunciations. But worldwide last year, according to State Department statistics, there were 1,700 odd renunciations worldwide. So only 1,700 people actually gave up their US passport. And it saddens me as an American that anyone would give up their US passport. But don't forget, at the same time, over 500,000 people were naturalized in the United States. 500,000 new citizens, 1,700 gave up. It's a rounding error. The year before, in 2011, there was 700,000 naturalizations in the United States. But let's go back and let's focus on why would anyone renunciate? Personally, I believe the United States is one of the greatest countries in the world, Switzerland as well. So why would I ever want to give up my US passport? And the real issue comes down to, again, this culture of fear and compliance and the burdens that the governments and the regulators have put on the average person. And when you're an overseas American, a lot of these renunciations are second Americans. They're people that what we call accidental Americans. Maybe they have an American father, but a Swiss mother. They've grown up in Geneva. They've never been to the United States. They might not even speak English that well, but they have the passport just because they had an American father. And then all of a sudden they realize when they're 30 years old, wait a minute, if you're a US citizen, you actually have citizen-based taxation consequences. Just because you're a US citizen, you have to pay tax back in the United States. And you have all these reporting requirements that are getting more and more difficult, more and more burdensome, FATCA, Form 8938, F-bars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For the average person, I mean, this causes a tremendous amount of stress, a tremendous amount of psychological burdens in their lives, and they think, have I complied? Have I put in all the right documents? If I haven't filed my F-bars, are they going to come in? Are they going to take my bank account? Are they going to take my pension? Can I get a job? I mean, a lot of multinational companies will not hire Americans because if they hire you as an American and you have a signatory on the account, technically you're supposed to report all those accounts. So they say, oh, you're a US citizen, no more jobs. So there's a lot of heavy requirements to having the US citizenship. And if you are an overseas American, you're a second citizen, you just have the passport as an accidental American, maybe it makes a lot of sense to give it up. I know a lot of those people who have renunciated personally. I come across them just as my role in the overseas American community. And I can tell you, they're great people. They're very patriotic. They don't hate the United States at all. But it's an easier decision when it comes and they look at all of the regulatory burdens that go with carrying a U.S. passport. They don't plan to go back to the United States to live there. They're very happy to have their lives outside of the country. And if I could make a prediction, I'd say you're probably going to see the trends and renunciations continue to rise until FATCA is fully implemented. So this year, I think we'll see even more. Next year, we'll probably see even more. Then as FATCA gets fully implemented, everyone has reporting requirements. People are going to realize, okay, all my data is getting turned over anyways, so it won't really be such a question of reporting requirements.
So in your view then, what can be done to tackle this renunciation then?
Well, I'm here today on behalf of American Citizens Abroad, and American Citizens Abroad is working on a solution right now. They would like to move towards resident-based taxation. The United States is one of the only countries in the world that taxes its citizens based upon citizen-based taxation. So U.S. citizens, no matter where they are in the world, have to pay this global tax. If we move towards a resident-based taxation, it should address all these issues. If your viewers would go to the American Citizens Abroad website at americansabroad.org, there is an excellent video on the website that outlines all of the positive aspects of why we should move towards resident-based taxation.
And thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your views.
Thank you.
That's all we've got time for right now, but stay tuned to Dukascopy TV for plenty more exclusive interviews. Goodbye for now.